access to the print method. So if we flip back over to our main.go file, here it is right here. Remember that we had created this new variable called cards, and cards is of type dec. So because cards is of type dec, we can now call the print method on the cards variable. 100% made possible because we just set up that receiver. So that's the purpose of a receiver. The receiver sets up methods on variables that we create. Let's break down the syntax of that thing a little bit more and get a better sense of what's going on. Okay, here we go. So again, function name, print, and then inside of those parentheses right before it, we said D and then dec. Now the word dec right there is a reference to the type that we want to attach this method to. So because we said dec right here, that is what specifically says any variable of type dec now gets access to the print method. Right before the word dec, however, was the variable D. The variable D right here is a reference to the actual kind of like working variable or the instance of the dec variable that we're working with. So in our case, over here inside the main function, we had created this variable called cards, and then we called print on it. Now when print is executed, you can imagine that we take this cards variable right here, and that cards variable gets passed into our print function as the variable called D. So D right here essentially is a reference to that cards array. We can think of it as being exactly cards. And so if I change the code out to look a little bit more like this, it looks very similar to the for loop that we had before inside of our main function. So cards is a reference to the actual copy of the dec type variable that we're working with. Now, if we were working with any other type of language, specifically like if we were working with Python or Ruby or JavaScript, you could think of this cards receiver variable right here as being very similar to the word this or the word self. Now with Go, we very specifically, by convention, we never use the word this or self. We always refer to the receiver as like the actual thing that it is, rather than calling it this or self. But if it helps at all, you can think of this cards argument as being like this or self. Now, the last thing you might be curious about is why we called it D in our actual implementation. So I'm going to change it back to D right here, by the way. By convention, we usually refer to the receiver with a 1 or 2 letter abbreviation that matches the type of the receiver. So in this case, because our receiver is of type dec, we refer to the actual copy or the reference to this object, the reference to the actual dec, simply as D. So just the first letter. Now, again, this is by convention. You don't have to do this. If you want to, you could call it my dec, or you can certainly call it this if you want. You can do whatever you want for the name, but by convention, we usually call it simply D, or a 1 or 2 or 3 letter abbreviation. Now, personally, I think that's, kind of challenging to keep in your head, like, oh, what is D? What variable is this? I mean, how many other programming languages have you worked with where everyone always said never use single letter variables? However, this is convention with Go, and so throughout the course, we are usually going to refer to the receiver argument as simply like D or B or whatever is appropriate, just 1 or 2 letters. But again, you can think of this as being like this or self inside of any other language. Okay. So this is right here a great example of how we define a new type that extends an existing type and then add some custom method to that new type. So this right here is a pattern that we're going to see throughout the language, just